Welcome to Cross Party Lines with Chris Finlayson, Phil Goff, and myself, Sam Collins. It's a podcast designed to unpack New Zealand politics so that you don't have to. We've got a new episode every Tuesday, so if you are enjoying it, please do share it with a friend or five. Firstly, our thoughts go out to all those that are impacted by the storms in the lower North Island over the past 72 hours. Just as we spoke about a few weeks ago, we'd like to call for more cross-party work on tackling both the causes of and adaptation to climate change, because scenes like we're seeing in Wellington, and hopefully we won't see in Christchurch as it moves toward them overnight, they're not going anywhere if we don't do anything about it. So today we'll be looking into some of the inquiries that were announced over the last week. We'll talk about the need for civility in public discourse, but first we're going to discuss some of the policy announcements from the minor parties over the weekend. For context, we're recording this on Monday the 16th of February, so let's get into it. Last week, New Zealand First announced that they will run in 2026 with a policy of a referendum on the existence of Māori seats. And then over the weekend, ACT leader David Seymour announced that they will run on a platform to reduce the number of government departments to under 30 and cap the number of ministers at 20. Just for reference, there are currently over 40 government departments and 28 ministers, 8 of which sit outside of cabinet. So Phil, what are your impressions of these announcements from the smaller coalition parties?
Well, deja vu all over again. How many times have we heard the promise that they're going to do away with Māori seats? Quite ironic coming from Winston Peters, who first stood for Parliament for the seat of Northern Māori in 1975 and didn't have a word of criticism when he won all of the Māori seats for New Zealand First in 1996. But times and political needs change, and the old, let's scratch this itch, let's appeal to this prejudice comes out again. I mean, ironically, John Key promised the same thing in 2008, and then he rode back on it for a couple of reasons. One, he was in coalition with the Māori Party, so that gave him a pretty strong reason to do it. But he also said that it was too divisive, that he wouldn't do it unless Māori people wanted that done, and that this would lead to hikois from hell, I think was the expression he used. Why do away with them? They've been there for 150 years. They don't give a special advantage to Māori because one person, one vote exists whether you're on the Māori roll or the general roll. And Māori see it as a particular facet of their role as a treaty partner, that they have the ability to elect from Māori seats. And the number of Māori seats will depend on what Māori people themselves want, shown by whether they enrol on the general seat or the Māori seat. So what you're doing is you're appealing to, Peters has tried this time and again. He'll use prejudice against migrants on one side and against Māori people on the other, notwithstanding the fact of his own Māori heritage. So purely to win votes, never expects to deliver on that, won't deliver on it, but we'll just scratch that itch again. So we've got that on one side, and then of course we've got the Shane Jones stuff, which, look, I'm all in favour of having restrictions to ensure the sustainability of shellfish. But when you single out one particular group and tell the Chinese, don't eat our shellfish, eat your Peking duck, that's designed as a dog whistle once again, and pretty awful. So look, enforce the rules around shellfish, but don't pick on one group, because it's not just one group that are breaching the rules and the need for sustainability. There'll be people from a whole lot of communities that are doing that. This is simply to appeal to that prejudice.
And we'll pick up on some of those messages from Shane Jones towards the end when we talk a bit more about the civility in politics. Because, those dog whistles I found particularly pungent, to be honest. But Chris, what was your view on the referendum position? And if you were, obviously you would have been in the National Party senior officers when they were talking about John Key's version of this. Do you think where this is sort of history coming to repeat itself, or was the National Party looking at something different or different reasons when they were talking about it in 2008?
No, I think Phil summarised it very well. John thought it was unnecessarily divisive and moved on. And it had originally been Don Brash's speech at Orewa. Got a lot of thinking going. But, really, I've heard it all before. It's Phil summarised as just rehash nonsense. Apparently, in 2017, it was going to be a bottom line and he was going to have a referendum. Never came up in coalition negotiations, as I understand it, with Labour. So it's just the same old rubbish. So many parliaments have reserved seats. I was going to quiz Phil and say, what are the reserved seats in the House of Commons?
Ooh, you've got me there, mate. What are they?
There are 2 special seats in the House of Commons that aren't based on population. They are the Western Isles and the Isle of Man. So there you go.
There you go. I've learned something. Yeah.
And after you were High Commissioner to London, you should have known that.
I stand rebuked.
Yeah. The second policy, and we'll come to Jones in a minute, but the idea of cutting down on government departments, well, actually, it's a very good idea. And ministers have grown like Topsy over the years, normally to accommodate some clown from a minor party who needs to be recognised. And so they make that person Associate Minister of Consumer Affairs or something stupid. And at one stage, I think, under the Labour government of Helen Clark, there would have been 2 or 3 associate ministers of arts. So, I mean, I'm not being critical of Helen Clark, because you've got to accommodate all these people, and it's the way it goes. But it's all a bit stupid, really. And so I agree with David, but the first ministry I'd probably abolish is the Ministry of Regulation, which reminds me of Humphrey Appleby in the Ministry of Administrative Affairs, where there were great debates on the policy of administration or the administration of policy. I have a particular beef about the Ministry of Regulation because so many of the issues that it wanted to look at were covered in the Great Legislation Act, which I passed, and Parliament actually passed. I shouldn't get ideas above mistakes. Parliament passed in 2011, and then David Parker added to it, and we it's just play acting in my view. So what I would do is I would follow David's advice. I think 20 is probably about right. We don't need associate ministers. Two things I would do were I drawing up a cabinet would be, and Phil could comment on it, I've always thought the position in the United Kingdom of Chief Secretary to the Treasury, the most junior member of the UK Cabinet, is number 2 in Treasury and is solely responsible for public expenditure. And people like John Major were Chief Secretary to the Treasury. It was immediately before he became Chancellor when Nigel Lawson resigned. I actually think someone who's laser focused on expenditure probably would never hold any other post, because he or she would become so unpopular, would never get ahead. But so there's that. And the other thing that I think we should try is there's a place for non-departmental ministers. Everyone wants a portfolio or a department, but in the United Kingdom, you would have these sinecure officers like Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster or Lord Privy Seal, and they would be responsible for EU negotiations or something like that. And so a couple of non-departmental ministers focusing on particular issues, maybe combined with being leader of the House, is, I think, a way we should go. But with respect, David is correct. I think there are too many departments, but you have to be careful about this reorganisation, because IMBY was formed, and I don't think IMBY has ever really worked. And so massively important issues like intellectual property reform copyright law reform in particular, are not being addressed. They're sort of dealt with at tier 3, when really it's a major and important issue for the economy. And if we had a separate Department of Commerce, which we used to have, they could deal with it. But and mergers of government departments can be massively disruptive. So good idea. Execution is going to be very important.
Yeah, I'd start with 2 departments I'd abolish, or ministries. One is the Ministry of Racing. Now, who's the Minister of Racing? God knows why we have a Minister of Racing. I wonder what Winston Peters thinks about that.
He's the Minister of Horse Racing, not Greyhound Racing.
Yeah, apparently. But the other one, the new ministry set up for regulations is, I think, the most expensive per capita of any of the ministries. But I want to pick up on Chris's last point. I was around long enough to see departments pulled apart, put back together, pulled apart. Well, it is totally disruptive. When you're restructuring, people are worried about their jobs, work doesn't get done, the minister is focused on the restructuring process rather than the policy development process. So before you start tampering with those things, you've got to make sure you know what you're doing and what you're planning to do works and is not simply going to be a temporary phase where you pay out huge sums in redundancy and then re-employ people again after you've decided that doesn't work. So it's an easy thing to do. It's about creating an image for himself that he's against bureaucrats and he wants to cut down costs. But, you can reduce the number of ministries and not reduce the cost of performing those tasks. So, some of the stuff is reasonably marginal in terms of the saving. So, it can be expensive, it can be disruptive. Make sure you've thought through, you know what you're doing. Try to do it if you can, hope springs eternal, on a bipartisan basis, so you don't simply have a reversal at the time of the next election. But don't do it for political reasons. Do it for reasons of efficiency and effectiveness. And make sure you've, as my father was my late father was a tradesman, or used to say, measure twice and cut once. Work out that you're doing it in the right place and then do it. Don't cut and say, oh, maybe that wasn't such a good idea after all. So, more politics, I suspect, than genuine ability to cut down. And the problem is, of course, with coalition government, every coalition partner wants to have their people given some role as a form of patronage. And it's that has created, I think we've probably got a bigger ministry now than we've ever had before, Chris. Is that...
and half of them wouldn't do very much at all.
Yeah. Then again, look, I think there's a ton of work a minister can do, but you've got to have. It's no good having the work, but not a minister that's capable of doing it. So sometimes you're appointing ministers for the wrong reason, and they don't do a particularly good job, and they might as well not be there. But if you've got a person that's got initiative, that's self-motivated, that really wants to make a mark, is prepared to put the hours in, then that person will actually do a good job in governing over the departments and making sure that they're reflecting what the government wants and what people need.
And if I could give you an illustration which proves why Phil is right, in the late 1990s, the Department of Justice was dismembered and they created the Ministry of Courts, the Department of Corrections, the Ministry of Justice, and then the Commercial Affairs Division was sent over to this new Department of Commerce. But it was just a ginormous cock-up, really. The Ministry of Courts lasted through one chief executive and then was merged back into Justice. As I said, Commerce never really achieved its aim. It would have been much better as the Commercial Affairs Division of Justice, and they could deal with those issues. Corrections is a big department, but it could be part of the Department of Justice. And Palmer used to tell me that if there was a real problem with corrections, he'd send someone over from another part of the Ministry of Justice, or Department of Justice as it then was, to sort things out. He used to tell the corrections people they could have 5 escapes a year or something. And so that was an example of a dismembering and reorganization that was totally flawed.
Yeah, my reflection on it is, in both the policies, is that it's moving around deck chairs and actually not going to make all that. Neither of those policies will make all that much difference to the electoral math in terms of pulling anyone over to the right block, because I think anyone that's going to vote for them already there.
I do think David's policy has some merit. It's very hard to discern any merit in the rehash policy about the referendum on the Māori seats. is, like most New Zealand First policies, utterly devoid of substance and merit.
I was going to ask you both about what Chris Hipkins might be able to do with the Winston Peters announcement, but to be honest, I think I know what you're both going to say about that. So we might move on to the next topic. So the most used word in New Zealand media last week was the word inquiry. We had calls for independent inquiries into the Moore Point sewage failure in Wellington. 2 inquiries have been launched into the devastating slips in the Bay of Plenty earlier in the year. And finally, Nicola Willis announced an inquiry into the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, focusing on their monetary policy during the COVID-19 pandemic. Chris, a few people have proclaimed that perhaps one of these things is not like the other or the others. What's your reading of the situation?
Yeah, well, I think generally well-focused inquiries can address major issues extraordinarily well. And that's why I think it was Nathan Guy, when he was Minister of Internal Affairs, pushed through the Inquiries Act. I must say I am a bit bemused about the inquiry into the Reserve Bank. Has hints of an election year political special reporting a couple of weeks before the election. I would have thought it should have been done, if it was to be done, 2 years ago. And it just has a few warning signs for me about the principle of the independence of the Reserve Bank. That's something we cherish. I think, was it your administration, Phil, David Cagle was responsible for introducing that legislation, I think, in the late 80s. And the focus of the bank, which was to be staunchly independent, was to fight inflation. And I think throughout various administrations, it's done a pretty good job. So it does have connotations of a political stitch-up to me, and I think it's 2 years too late.
Yeah, look, I think the essence of whether an inquiry is worthwhile or not is that it's seen to have competent people who act with integrity and who act independently. As soon as an inquiry looks like it's done with a political goal, you're wasting your time, because a large percentage of the population is simply not going to accept it. And I noticed with the timing of the Reserve Bank inquiry, Cabinet apparently passed the decision to have an inquiry into the Reserve Bank during COVID 6 months ago. So why did they leave it until February to make that announcement? And even somebody with, leaning quite a long way to the right, like Heather Duplessis-Helen, said, this is just nonsense. Anything that's going to come out at the beginning of an election campaign is being done for political purposes. And clearly it is. Look, I think there should be an inquiry. I think that our Reserve Bank, in common with central banks right across the world, responded to COVID, and I'm talking now with the benefit of hindsight, which is a great tool of analysis, hindsight. They overinflated the economy. I mean, I remember talking to people in government when COVID started, when I was mayor, and they were saying we're expecting 15% unemployment, and it was a bleak outlook. And undoubtedly, the Reserve Bank, I think they created something like $55 million worth of extra, $1 billion worth of extra currency. And that, of course, led on to, far from having a recession, we overheated the economy, house prices went up 30%, etc. Now, I think you have an inquiry not to scapegoat the people that might have been responsible for those decisions, but to say, how did they come to make those decisions? Were they the right decisions? And what should we do next time to make sure that we get better decision making and achieve the objectives we really want to? So, 2 years ago was a perfect time to say, let's have an inquiry into it. Let's find out how we can do it better for when the next pandemic or such event comes along. But this just looks political, and therefore I think its conclusions aren't going to carry much weight with people. And I think people are pretty cynical about it now. We all remember COVID, but it's 4 years ago. So why leave it till now? Why do it now? I think the other inquiries, Moore Point and the landslips in the Bay of Plenty, I I think it's good to have an inquiry outside of the council that's responsible for, one, the delivery of wastewater services in Wellington, and secondly, the question on the back of all of our minds, council was given warning on the morning of the landslide. Why was that warning not taken more seriously? We do need answers to that, and the answers will carry more weight if they're done independently than if they're done by the council that's investigating its own actions. There is one other inquiry, and that's the judicial conduct hearing against Judge Emma Aiken, and I've got a particular interest in this because I passed the piece of legislation which set up the judicial conduct panel, and the idea was to respect judicial independence, which is absolutely critical, but also to have some degree of accountability if a judge behaves in a way that's egregiously bad. This is the first time, as I understand it, that it's been used. And I've followed it in the media. I don't have any particular insights to it. I think perhaps the judge was unwise, but I don't think she was guilty of behaviour that would be worthy of contemplating dismissal. That's not what I had in mind in passing that legislation. I was worried that that there wasn't enough accountability for judges. That I think of a few examples, and I've no point in regurgitating history now, but judges that claimed on expense allowances for hotel accommodation when they flew home that night and never used it. Now, that is egregiously bad. That's misuse of public funds. That's the sort of thing that I had in mind and that I was involved in at the time, and under the previous government to when I came in. Somebody yelling out, that's untrue or that's a lie, as they pass a function room where somebody's made some comment that she strongly disagreed with, probably not wise, but not worthy of contemplating dismissal in my mind.
Yeah, the Judicial Conduct Commissioner is the filter for a lot of these complaints, and many of the complaints that come in are from people who moan that the judge was rude to me. Well, I just think of some of the judges I've appeared before, and they weren't models of diplomacy. And if they needed to kick you in the teeth because your submission was stupid, well, so be it. I always think of one of my favourite judges, Justice Barker, who died a few years ago. They used to call him the Emperor because he used to rule the High Court in Auckland with an iron fist. And he came to Wellington once, and a friend of mine stood up and said, all I require is 5 minutes of your Honour's time. He said, well, you're not getting it. Your application is ridiculous and is dismissed. Now, these days, someone would lay a complaint to the Judicial Conduct Commissioner about that, but really, Justice Barker was absolutely right. The only serious one I can think of prior to this one, and I'm not going to comment on this one because it's before the still on the way, but there was the one about my former partner, Bill Wilson. I stood to one side as attorney when that issue came up. It was all about the horse racing and not declaring an interest and so on. And poor Bill died at the end of last year. It should never have gone to from the commissioner to the judicial panel had it not been for a former judge, Ted Thomas, deciding to get in on the act, and he decided he would lay a complaint against Bill Wilson and so on. It got very unpleasant, and but Ted Thomas always liked to be the centre of attention, and there wasn't any opinion that he didn't have that was absolutely totally correct, because he was above reproach. But in my view, he acted totally improperly, and it's a basic rule of judges that retired judges should just shut up. And Bill, in actual fact, was never in debt anyway, so it was all completely unfair. So that was, and just destroyed the man, quite frankly. So you're right. I mean, you get hauled before you go to that next stage. So many complaints go to the commissioner, who just basically writes back and says, thanks very much, dismissed. You can dismiss a lot of them immediately. But when it goes to the panel, it's pretty heavy stuff, because the consequences are, a vote in the House, Phil, to determine whether or not you're biffed out. So it's pretty heavy stuff. And so the panel looking at it, chaired by former Court of Appeal Judge Brendan Brown, current Court of Appeal Judge Jill Mallon, and Sir Jerry Mataparai, very experienced people, they'll be looking at it very carefully.
From a political level, and just to play devil's advocate here for a sec, both these, I guess what we know is that we live in an attention economy, and we're going to head into a topic in a sec where we are talking about some of that attention economy and how it's expressed. But we live in an attention economy, and what we have right now is we have Winston Peters and New Zealand First in the headlines all this week. And what we know when the COVID inquiry comes back, or the RBNZ inquiry, on the COVID spending comes back, is that they'll be connecting Labour back to that period where those that are willing to vote for National think that spending was out of control. I say with air quotes. So I guess at a hard-nosed political space, we understand that maybe the moral justification for some of these things isn't there. But from a hard-nosed political space, if you were staring down the barrel of what might be a very close election, Phil, would this not be something you'd look at in terms of engineering the inquiry to come out just before the election?
I think politicians are always tempted by politics. That's quite correct. Doesn't make it the right thing to do. You can score a political point, but you can damage a system that you really want to build confidence in. And I think if you're going to have an inquiry of that nature, you do it for serious reasons and proper and appropriate reasons. You don't do it to play politics with it. And the public's not that bloody stupid anyway. They know a political game when they see it. So, I think, as I mentioned before, when you get right-wing commentators questioning a right-wing coalition government's decision, then you've got to say, well, they've overreached themselves here. They should have shown a little bit more responsibility and decorum and done it properly and in a timely way, not to score a political point off. Politicians seem to believe that when they score political points, they win, but often they're just seen as scoring political points.
And I'm always very worried about what could be called lawfare against former politicians. And so with the Royal Commission into the massacre in Christchurch, Andrew Little, Jacinda Ardern were sitting ministers. They actually went down and spent quite some time with the Commission. John Key and I did as well. And I spent 3 or 4 hours with them because they were interested in the role of the security services in the period leading up to the massacre. I was responsible for them from 2014 to 2017, so I was, quote, a person of interest, but it was held behind closed doors and it was never politicized, as in party politicized. Play politics with these inquiries. I think Phil's right. No one takes them seriously, but you can damage the whole process of an inquiry as a result.
There you go. Well, I had to ask the question. I had to play devil's advocate. I always say that I'm trying to be a centrist on the show, don't I? We'll move on to the next topic that we had, which is ironically a bit connected to what we were just talking about. We all know that in 2026, the outrageous discourse is on the menu du jour, and last week had some fantastic examples, both here and abroad. If you haven't seen it, Pam Bondi's testimony in the House about the Epstein files was purely performatively indignant, and then Shane Jones, as Phil said earlier on, had some crass words about immigrants and collecting kaiwana from rock pools, which I will try not to repeat. Chris, I guess kind of as we were just saying about the inquiries, what's the antidote to this performative aggression that we've got going on here? You were very keen to talk about civility in public life.
Yeah, well, I mean, Phil and I used to go at one another hammer and tongs, and that was all good fun. Phil tried to refer me once to the Privileges Committee, and I reread the letter that I wrote in response to your complaint, and I said that Mr. Gough is a very experienced politician who has been in this parliament for many years, apart from an enforced sabbatical when he was beaten by Gilbert Miles, and I put because I knew that would get up your nose big time. So
I got my U2.
yeah.
Against Gilbert.
Well, of course. I mean, it was only, that he ever won was just unbelievable, frankly, because he was such an idiot. But, you don't need to be unpleasant. And in preparation for this, I was, last week I mentioned Dennis Healy, but if you want a brilliant, civilized, clever speech, Michael Foot's speech in the winding up the debate, he was leader of the House of Commons in 1979, before the vote was taken. Now, Michael Foot was led, what did they say about the 1983 Labour manifesto in England? It was the longest suicide note in history. So he may not have been a completely brilliant leader, but by God, he was a great House of Commons performer. And that speech is side-splittingly funny. And so clever humour and self-deprecatory humour in many ways, the light touch can be so much more devastating than the performance by, I wondered how I could describe Pam Bondi, but I think, to put it bluntly, Florida scrubber, rough as guts. Her contribution was simply atrocious. To think that this dreadful person, the cipher of Trump, follows in the footsteps of Elliot Richardson, who was Nixon's Attorney General, got rid of Agnew, but resigned rather than fire the Watergate Special Prosecutor, a man of unimpeachable integrity. Robert Jackson, who was FDR's Attorney General, pretty lousy cross-examiner of Goering at Nuremberg.
Yes. I watched Nuremberg the other night. It was very good.
He didn't know how to handle it, but David Maxwell Fyfe got that big fat Nazi. But, these guys were top quality. I dealt with Eric Holder, who was Obama's attorney. He was a first-class fellow. And the other one I dealt with was Jeff Sessions, and we were a little bit worried about him. He was Trump's first attorney, and he was a United States Senator from Alabama, and we thought, when we had our meeting of the quintet of attorneys general, good Lord, what's going to turn up here? But he turned out a good bloke, and anyway, he was fired for defending the rule of law with Trump. So, the office of Attorney General in the United States, Robert Kennedy's another, not the funny one who's Secretary of Health.
Not his son. Yeah.
These are top quality people, outstanding politicians and statespeople. And for this person to turn up and behave the way she did so dishonors the office of attorney. And the other thing I would say is she's not even very good at it, because apparently the camera zoomed in on her book and she had all her insults laid out. So, you washed up lawyer, you weren't even a lawyer, well, you was only a professor of constitutional law for 25 years. Real low class, bad. So having preached civility in politics and referred to her as a scrubber from Florida, some of your listeners would think I'm a hypocrite, which is probably correct, but by God, she was a shocker.
Yeah, she's typical of the sycophants that Trump has surrounded himself with. And, Attorney General, you anticipate that person will act with a degree of integrity and independence. I haven't seen much of either in her case. But I went back and I mean, it's very entertaining. You can watch them on YouTube. And, the Congress people that are asking the questions are passionate in what they ask. There's a lot of theatre coming from them. She's responding by attack being the best method of defence when you have no defence. So she outrages them by abusing them, being highly personal, very politicised the whole way through. All you could say is that that wouldn't happen in a non-democracy. At least you have the ability to have the person there and to ask the questions. That's the strength of the system. The weakness of the system is that she didn't answer any of the questions. And the people asked the questions in a way where they let her off the hook. The more passionate and the more partisan they became, that then she responded in a like manner, and nobody was left any of the wiser. People made their points politically, but there wasn't a true interrogation of what had happened and an analysis of, whether the right policies were being adopted and whether, the stuff that was in the Epstein files had been properly released, whether people were being held to account, etc. So you didn't come out of the hearings any wiser. You came out of it entertained, but that's not the point of a hearing. The point of a hearing is to be informative, to be analytical, to try to get to the bottom of what you're inquiring about, and to make some progress. And absolutely no progress was made. But she, I don't know whether I can beat the term scrubber. It was pretty appalling. And I think Chris has laid out the sort of people that we might have expected to hold that position in the past, and it shows you how far the American system has fallen from being a robust democracy where people can be held to account and where people do follow the rules. So, yeah. It's worth a watch for any of our listeners that want to see how a congressional system works. I quite like the congressional system of hearings. They're far more robust than what New Zealand has in its select committees. But this just took it to the ultimate extent of abuse and counter-abuse and took us nowhere. She should not be Attorney General. In fact, most of the cabinet members shouldn't be cabinet members. They were chosen for one reason and one reason alone. Trump learnt something from his first administration. He constantly had a handbrake put on his extreme ideas and proposals by people that actually were committed to the system rather than to him personally. And he said, that's never going to happen again. So people were chosen not on their ability, not on their integrity, but the fact that they were yes people. And that damages, in my view, the American system.
And his first nominee for Attorney General was going to be that fellow from another Floridian, Matt Gaetz. Do you remember him? Wasn't he charged with abuse or something? I don't know. But one thing you do notice about the American system, and old Lockwood would never have tolerated it, they don't know how to ask questions. They preface everything with a 5-minute speech. And you said you'd watched Nuremberg. Well, old Jackson, he couldn't cross-examine Goering. He was making speeches and getting blasted by Francis Biddle. And it took David Maxwell Fyfe, who apparently wasn't supposed to be not all that crash hot at cross-examination, but he did a good job with Goering because he asked questions. And he asked closed questions, not open questions, so that they had to answer. So, Goering had to answer yes or no. And so the secret, I think, when you're asking questions in the House of Representatives in New Zealand is don't preface it with a little epistle, ask a question. And if it's a supplementary question, don't ask two questions, because you just give the questioner the option of answering whatever he or she wants. Now, the person who used to be very good at asking very precise questions that would often pin people to the wall was Trevor Mallard, because he knew, don't ask compound questions, ask very careful questions, carefully drafted. And the other thing is, and so often do you find in the House, people would stand up with a series of prepared questions and wouldn't deviate from them. Sometimes you've just got to deviate from the questions. I always used to enjoy, does the minister stand by all his statements? Because often I'd say no. And then sometimes the supplementary questions would just flow on. Well, surely to God, the next question would be if the minister said no, so what statements doesn't he stand by?
And for those that don't watch a lot of the House on Parliament TV, that is usually the first question of all the prepared questions, because then the idea is you ask them if they've stood by them, and then you try and get them on a gotcha.
and they don't know what's going to follow. If they ask a key question that shows the line of questioning you're going to follow, they'll be prepared for it. But if you ask them, do they stand by all their statements, the next a supplementary question can go anywhere. There's a couple of things that come out of that. One, the more precise you are in your question, and the more, actually those senators would have done better simply to have a measured question and leave the passion aside. That's interesting and it's theatrical, but it doesn't get you anywhere. Ask a measured question, and when she doesn't answer, come back and just ask the question again. And then that would have shown her up better. But the other thing that was lacking in that was an absence of chairmanship. You would think that the chair would both ask the questioner to be precise in what they're asking, and the person answering it that's under scrutiny to address the question. And that doesn't happen. I mean, I'm not saying our system's perfect. As a minister, I don't think I ever got caught out on a question. I think that the more interesting place for questions is actually at the select committee, where it's more free flowing. And people do in a select committee ask questions that they might not have simply prepared. In the House, almost everybody has got their SUPs already worked out, and they need to listen to what the answer is, because if they do that, they can then pin the minister for what they've said, and they're going to be more effective. But that wasn't effective in the House. I tell you what, I was watching the Australian Question Time just last week when I was over there, and that's even worse than our system, because there's no supplementary questions. You just get the first question, and it is a speech, and then you get a speech and reply. There is not an exchange by way of, I have this question and I expect you to answer the question. So our system isn't perfect. It's better than the Aussies, but it could still be improved. And the Americans need to go a long way if they actually want to use a session like that to hold people accountable rather than get a television grab.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's probably what it comes down to a lot of the time, especially in that American system that you're talking about, Phil, is that people aren't actually there for the question and the hearing and getting to the truth. They're there for the 40-second, minute and a half long clip that they can put in their own social media to use to get re-elected, which I guess for me begs the question, should we just be banning all politicians from social media? Would that help some of the civil discourse that we've got if they don't have their own platform and it's down to the journalists?
Senators are inveterate windbags, and they love the sound of their own voices, and that is the way they operate. Whereas, do you remember Chris Christie having a flick at Marco Rubio in 2016? He said, you just go down to Washington and bloviate for half an hour. I'm here in New Jersey having to deal with snow. And so, but senators are just chronic windbags, and so they preface all their questions. They don't realize that if they followed the Phil Goff approach, they could ask precise questions and crucify the Attorney General, because she didn't strike me as someone who was particularly smart. And the same would apply to the Secretary of Homeland Security. I would defenestrate them by being nice and asking short questions. And did you see always be careful of United States senators who declare that they're not standing again because they seem to find their independence. And Senator Tom Tillis had been questioning some Trump sycophant, and Trump called him a loser, and he was asked about it on television. Senator Tillis, the president has called you a loser. Do you have any comments? Well, he said, yes. Well, clearly I'm delighted, because if I'm a complete loser, then obviously I'm qualified to be Secretary of Homeland Security or Chief of Staff.
Yeah, humor's a great weapon if you have the ability to exercise it. It's but Bondi would have been really more devastated if the person had asked a straight question in a level tone, because then if she obviously had a book full of abuse and things that she wanted to attack them on. But if somebody asks you a reasonable question and you attack them, the public looks at that and say, why didn't she answer the question? If somebody launches into an attacking question, then it's a tit for tat. And what the commentary afterwards showed is that the Democrats said that she was appalling and useless and terrible, and Trump and his supporters said she was absolutely outstanding. and the middle ground often said, "Oh, that's politicians and play acting again." So it didn't get anybody anywhere in the end.
It got Pam Bondi about as far as me trying to bait you two with saying that politicians should be banned from social media, which didn't work on either case. I'm going to get both of you one of these days with one of those questions. But anyway,
I'd never been involved in social media. In fact, I barely understand what you're talking about.
There you go.
On that note, that will bring us to the end of the show. Thank you very much for everyone that listened. Don't forget to follow us on all the podcast apps that you listen on: Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Follow us on Substack if you can, and as I always say, share with at least 5 friends. Thank you very much, guys. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers.